Again, insisting on including modern human in the title for the podcast because this is an evolution course. We can now see what we are doing for the future. As we said, there are many details: renewables, energy, food production and emission reduction, climate justice, climate equity, etc., etc. But we can summarize these things into a couple of key figures. This is the 2030 emissions gap. What is an emissions gap? It's basically the difference between the trajectories we are on, including all the pledges and targets under the Paris Agreement that countries are trying to follow, and the emissions that are needed to hit 1.5 degrees C target by 2100 with that 67% probability. So here we are in global greenhouse gas emissions in gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. As we said before, CO2 and CO2 equivalent are different basically based on converting the non-CO2 greenhouse gases into CO2 using their global warming potential and some details involved there. So here is the historical emissions that are estimated from 1990 onwards, and this includes land use change forcing. So when you deforest or afforest and so on, you are affecting albedo and energy exchange and energy balance. So that's included in here, emissions of course. So if we look at the trajectory we should have been on, we can see that all the pledges and targets made so far bring us in 2030 down here in this range of gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. But on the other hand, if you look at where we need to be by 2030, if we want to hit these targets, we are down here, and there is some updates done here. Climate Action Tracker is very diligent about constantly updating these, so September 2020 to November 2021. So old and revised one for a new one. Of course, there was COVID involved here, so to be careful. So Paris 1.5, the gap that remains here is 23 to 27 gigatons CO2 equivalent, which means we are emitting so much more than what we should to hit this target. Whereas the new NDCs to date narrow the gap in 2030 by around 3.3 to 4.7 gigatons CO2 equivalent, or 15 to 17% compared to the older trajectories we were on in terms of policies and targets. And we'll see that there are net zero targets proposed by a bunch of countries as well, in addition to corporations. So the new one by November 2021, it says if we want to hit Paris 1.5, the emissions gap will be down to 19 to 23 gigatons CO2 equivalent. So these are not small numbers, and this is about the impact of COVID and how we have deviated from the targets. Again, looking here now at global carbon emissions and gigaton CO2 equivalent per year. Going from 2019 to 2021, this looked at percentage CO2 emissions differences to previous years and daily averages in 2019. So with respect to the baseline, 2019 was above by 1.2%, and COVID brought down the emissions. So this is daily CO2 emissions in million tons of CO2 per day, so daily, minus 5.7%, so 35.3 gigatons. We dropped to 33.3 gigatons, and by 2021 we had jumped back to plus 4.8% or 34.9 gigatons CO2 equivalent. As I said before, many of the countries tried to revive the economies by in fact encouraging various activities which included production and consumption as well. And we'll see again which countries are doing better in that phase place as well. So here is the CO2 plus CH4, and this is just CO2, and you can clearly see the dip because of COVID, and then we have gone back, and now the percentage increases over time from 1970. We were at plus 1.7% growth per year, dropped to 0.7, 0.3, and then we jumped here to 2.1, and then flattened again to 1.3, and this is for methane here. So you can see the various numbers for CO2 here, 2.8 to 1.3, 1.1, back to 2.7. So both of them jumped, and then 1.7 here. So 1.5 degree scenarios require minus 8% per year drawdown or emissions reductions, and 2 degree C scenarios require minus 4% per year decrease in emissions in global CO2 equivalent emissions. And there is a range there based on various scenarios, because all the future activities require assumptions about various carbon cycle related carbon emission, greenhouse gas emission related activities, including population, transportation, renewable energies, and so on and so forth. So you can see that we are in this trap, the carbon trap, where we keep on going back to increasing emissions. This adds a comparison. So we are looking at 2030 emissions gaps again that we already looked at, so I'm not going to add to this, but we will add sectoral initiatives here. So change in CO2 greenhouse gas emissions in gigaton CO2 equivalent, NDCs are going to bring it down some, and there is NDC updates now, nationally determined contributions. India just signed off on its updates last week or so, in August 2022. Likely impact on the 2030 emissions gap from NDC updates plus sectoral initiatives are considered here as changes from September 2022 to November 2021. So sectoral initiatives, as a pie chart there, goes down to here. This gap that we talked about that has been reduced by the updates. And methane here, coal, so there is a agreement now on reducing methane emissions by 2030, so that's going to add something. Eliminating coal is going to add some reductions in emissions. Switching to EVs and afforestation, reduced deforestation, which includes restoration, management, and prevention of deforestation, is going to add this. So this here in detail is essentially 5.5 to 6.9 gigaton CO2 equivalent, or 24 to 25% of the gap required to reach 1.5 is going to be met by these NDC updates and sectoral initiatives. So human beings are busy thinking about these things, and then still there are differences in countries and the way they are doing business. So this is comparing 2020 compared to 2019 and 2021 compared to 2019 in terms of change in global fossil CO2 emissions by country. So you can see that Brazil 2020-2019 was less, and by 2021 with respect to 2019 it jumped. China has remained also jumped quite a bit. So the zooming out of the COVID impacts with increased activities is more than compensated for that. So EU 27 on the other hand remained less than 2019 still, similarly for France, India, but you can see the difference here that the reduction has been more than recovered, so it's basically close to zero here. So next year will be above again. Italy, Japan, rest of the world is doing better. So this is why we read this paper about whether COVID-19 can lead to a social mandate on reducing emissions to continue the good habits we may have developed around that time. Russian Federation, US, and the world as a whole. So there are differences in the way countries have reacted. Plus, if you look at overview of fiscal rescue and recovery measures of G20 members with high carbon neutral and low carbon impacts in total and as a share of 2020 GDP, again it shows that there are aggregate human behavioral evolutions and commonalities of behavior, and then there are cultural and geographical differences. Obviously confounds climate impacts as well on, let's say, heating, cooling, meat consumption, etc. But nonetheless, we are in this together, so we have to look at it in terms of the contribution to overall modern human goal to reducing emissions by 2100. So if you look at total in terms of the global recovery observations in US dollars, you can see that US dollars 354.98 billion, so this is highly negative. US 327.16 billion, so negative. This is highly negative, this is negative for these countries. Relatively neutral, positive, so better in terms of green spending, so percentage of GDP here. Highly positive at US $61.71 billion of the recovery funds, and it's unclear whether they are positive or negative over here. So the global community is generally always doing a one step forward, two step back kind of a dance when it comes to climate action. In other words, everybody is keen to do something, everybody wants to be part of the global action plan, Paris Agreement, NDCs, etc. But whenever there is a crisis like COVID or Ukrainian war, the invasion of Russia onto Ukraine, Germany is now beginning to burn more coal. China, many countries have had a negative impact in terms of energy supplies from Russia. What do you do when you have a booming economy and lifestyle that needs to be maintained? You obviously resort to burning whatever is available, like coal. So Germany, which is one of the most advanced progressive countries on climate action, has had a checkered history of how it deals with coal, that it is still digging up for coal, it is still burning coal, and with the Russian shortage of Russian gas, it is burning more coal as well. So the question is not just what modern human being is doing for climate change, but whether modern human beings' behavioral abilities can make sure that climate action continues no matter what the perturbations are. This is very unlikely, as it is obvious by now from the pandemics and wars, and this will continue over time as more and more other disasters will hit. That actually reducing emissions is going to be a great challenge, except if there are game changers coming along in technologies, mainly in renewable energies and carbon capture and sequestration. Okay, so good news, bad news kind of story. Intention is there, implementation is attempted, but perturbations are always used often almost as an excuse to go back to burning fossil fuels, especially coal, which is the worst offender of all of these fossil fuels. Okay.